I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, who is Brigitte Webster, who is a culinary historian, a home economics teacher, a cook, a furniture enthusiast. She has recently published a book called Eating with the Tudors in 2023 by Pen and Sword Books, which is a really good read. It's organized seasonally. So, for example, if you look up autumn, which is what we're in at the moment, you'll see that you should be busy collecting fruits and pickling things and preserving and killing your pig and salting your meat and getting ready for the winter. It's also got recipes in it, as well as lots of nuggets of information about what the Tudors were eating and why and when and how and all kinds of good stuff. Brigitte also owns and lives in a real Tudor house in Norfolk in England, and you can go and stay there, I believe. And I read that costumes are optional, so it is possible to be a full Tudor. She's also studying for an MA in the University of East Anglia in early modern history, and her dissertation involves actually recreating a Tudor vegetable garden for her house. So we're really pleased that you're here today. I have foolishly left my program there, so I don't know what the title of your talk is. But I'm sure it'll appear behind me in a minute. But we're very happy to welcome you. So.
Well, hello, everyone. After so many hugely interesting papers this morning by highly qualified specialists in their topic, it's a hard act to follow, trust me. So be easy on me, please. My name is Brigitte Webster, and I basically create dishes from authentic 16th century recipes. And I have done so for the last 15 years. And I am very honored to have been invited to talk to you about my work. And presenting my work today as an archaeological experimental food historian has a number of firsts to it. It's my first time in Ireland, my first public engagement with a non-culinary event, and very much to my own surprise, it's also the first time that I have had to purposefully analyze my contribution to history from an archaeological angle. It's not doing much. Help. Thank you. And yet, over a decade ago, my path into food history started with material culture through a practical course in porcelain restoration. You see some of my handiwork there. And being taught how to restore Tudor earthenware pipkins and bowls led to the urge to photograph the finished object with a period correct intended contents. And as they say, the rest is history. Due to food's perishable nature, we rarely see physical evidence of cooked dishes from the past, especially 500 years ago. A dish reconstructed from a historic recipe, however, may deliver a convincing result, provided every effort is made to adhere to contemporary methods in its creation and the use of authentic ingredients. In my talk, I will showcase that the recreation of historic food can indeed offer the perfect marriage between archaeology and history, a match made in the kitchen, so to speak, where a piece of fragmented ephemera, often meaningless without further analysis, comparison, and contextualisation, is being turned into its edible iteration through the use of archaeological or replicated tools of the trade. And you see here a number of those I use: pipkins, porringes, kettles, cauldrons, skillets, chafing dishes, gallipots, and many more. With the arrival of the printing press in England in the late 15th century and literacy levels on the rise, printed recipe books manifested themselves as the second most popular genre in their sale. And their sale proliferated noticeably in the 16th century. And you see a nice selection of those I work with. Most early Tudor recipes were originally aimed at competent, professional male cooks as a kind of aid memoir. And this does explain the earlier recipes' often complete lack of crucial information, such as a full list of ingredients, precise measurements, and general cooking instructions. Only towards the close of the 16th century, publishers started to target the affluent lady of the house, who was, however, unlikely to carry out the cooking herself, but more fed the information to her staff in the kitchen. Given the popularity of English cookery books in the 16th century and the fairly small number of surviving examples, we may accept this as an indication that there were not just prized possessions in the library, but must have been actively used too. For the most part, due to the object's fragile nature, I often work from digital copies with the original recipe books safely kept at the archives or in libraries. You see up on the slide a number of dishes I have recreated, so you can see there are nothing like Hollywood would like you to believe. However, frequently, early recipes mention the use of specific kitchen utensils for the cooking process, or vessels for serving and preservation purposes. and that's what you see presented on the slide. For a convincing and authentic outcome of the prepared dish, I always endeavor to use either original objects, mostly for serving and photographic purposes only, obviously, and also true replicas for cooking to complete the task. As I will show in my first recipe example, I generally work with reproduced written accounts and not the original textual object, which, strictly speaking, defines me as an historian, because I am working with the word, the original word, but not the authentic object. However, as we will see, some of these texts hold clues which support the practical application of historic kitchen equipment as part of my research. These courage-inducing tart recipes I have chosen because I am in Ireland today, and in a minute you will see the relevance. And these are basically describing the same dish, but are taken from different textual sources or different editions for comparison. These recipes are only displaying minor spelling differences, which present no consequential significance here. Hidden behind the unassuming words of this recipe lay hidden a fascinating number of new developments that the growing middling class experienced in Elizabethan England. So, let's briefly peel back the layers by asking some very basic questions. Question 1, who was the target readership of such a recipe? Question 2, who was the author and who was the commissioner? And question 3, when was it produced or published? Now that's the easy part, because the questions can easily be answered as we can retrieve the information from the title page itself. The target audience clearly are men and women. The authors are not always known, but for the 1596 edition, The Good Housewife's Jewel, it is clearly Thomas Dawson, as his name is shown at the very top. The earliest version of The Good Housewife's Jewel dates to 1587, a date clearly stated, but this edition lacks the author's name. However, we may assume that it is Thomas Dawson's earlier or first work, because the book's contents is almost identical to the 1596 edition, with some minor spelling differences. We don't always get to see who commissioned the print of a cookery book, but here in this example it is Edward White, dwelling at the little north door of St. Paul's at the sign of the gun, which is being mentioned. What is important to note is that both editions were printed in London between 1587 by John Wolfe and later in 1596 by an anonymous printer. This is important because London was the place to keep with deep pockets, international trade links, and where new fashions and food fads started. An almost identical recipe appears in The Good Housewife's Handmaid, which was published under an anonymous author in 1594, again in London. And we shall use this example, this particular recipe, to analyze the ingredients and what this means in the wider context. But first, let's pay attention to the recipe's mysterious title. What kind of dish are we expected to make? The title is indeed the only part in the whole recipe that denotes the making of a tart. And in typical Tudor manner, it assumes that the reader knows how to make the pastry anyway. So, in order to make the appropriate tart pastry, we would have to look for another contemporary source. And lucky for me, in 1597, Thomas Dawson, who we've just mentioned, obliges and provides a recipe for a fine paste in his version of the tart to provoke courage in man and woman recipe. His pastry was a bit of a luxury item because it contained butter and eggs, turning the once inedible crust into an enjoyable part of the dish, something a generation earlier could only dream about. The forerunner of the edible crust was known as a coffin. Those so-called coffins were prepared with only hot water and flour, making them extremely hard, but perfect for their use as a cooking vessel for the filling. Our second question dwells on what the recipe promises to deliver. And to unlock its 16th century secret, we need to first study the recipe's contents and its individual ingredients to find the key. But before we assess the ingredients, I would like to briefly draw your attention to an archaeological piece of interest in this recipe, namely the reference to a gentle cooking method with a so-called chaffing dish. These smart cooking devices could be purchased in several materials to suit variously deep pockets. And the embers were used to heat or cook delicate dishes, such as sauces or fruit mousses, with this particular implement. Some designs suggest a tabletop warming function. That is the case with the one on the far left, made from bronze. Others cooking over or near embers with the ash falling away through the hole in the bottom. And I think the picture at the bottom shows that quite clearly, how the ash comes falling out. Going back to our recipe, we look through the list of ingredients and we see good wine. Yeah, we can live with that. Then it mentions burr roots, which is now burdock, a potaton root, 1 ounce of dates, 8 yolks of eggs, 3 or 4 brains of cock sparrows, a little rose water, sugar, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, mace, and sweet butter, which is basically just unsalted butter. But there are 3 items that stand out as somehow odd. Burr root is now known as burdock, and its root is still popular in Asian cuisine. And burdock, if you haven't seen it in your garden, is a nasty thistle, and once it gets into your hair, it stays there, unless you're willing to have it cut out. And I am speaking of experience. Thomas Muffet, a Tudor physician who died in 1604, states that the young root is very nourishing and wholesome in April. That's before it develops those nasty thistles at the top. He tells his readers that burr roots came to England via Italy and France, and were very common in his time. We then look at the male sparrow brains, and that certainly raises an eyebrow. And their inclusion in this recipe might represent a bit of a mystery. But if we look for their benefits in Thomas Muffet's publication, The Health Improvements, where he states that in old times, eating any creature's head and brains was very much abject and a vile thing which all men cast away. He's most concerned because he believes that brains, for the most part, are exceedingly phlegmatic. That's bad. Of gross juice, hard passage, slow concoction, great heaviness, and so offensive to the stomach that being eaten last, or with any fat meat, they trouble the same exceedingly, and procure vomit. Just what you want to know, isn't it? And then we'll use it in a recipe. Well, he goes on, however, and in his own words, he says, if eaten at the beginning of dinner or supper, pig's brain and the brains of small birds are even counted as wholesome, apparently. So we're lucky. For my recreation of this recipe, I therefore felt it was entirely appropriate to use a tiny amount of pig's brain as a substitute. And I can confirm that my palate was unable to detect such small amounts, and it made no difference in either texture or taste. But the most exciting ingredient in this recipe is the potato. For this and the 1587 recipe are the earliest English recipes that mention the potato. Before we get too excited, though, we need to investigate this further, as potaton could potentially also refer to the sweet potato, a very different plant altogether. Both potatoes, the sweet and what I refer to here for this purpose, the common potato, were first mentioned by English herbalist John Gerard in his herbal of 1597. And here you see the page that mentions both, where he claims that he tried to grow them in his London garden, but observes that the cold winter had killed his sweet potato, but that the Virginian potato, that's the common potato, prospered as in their own native country. Most annoyingly for us, he mixes up the two plants, referring to the ordinary potato as the Virginia or bastard potato, and the sweet potato as the common potato or skirrets of Peru. We can tell because his illustrations and descriptions are surprisingly accurate and correct, and for anybody who's been growing both, they will easily recognize them depicted here, and probably also agrees with his description. However, the problem starts here. It was what we now refer to the common potato, and in his words, the Virginian potato, and not the sweet potato that came from Peru, that happens to be so perfect for the Irish and English climate. At the turn of the 17th century, the English had only started to colonize Virginia, where the sweet potato was at home. And comparing several contemporary accounts by physicians praising the sweet potato's aphrodisiac qualities, this recipe's unusual title is all of a sudden beginning to make a lot more sense. The sweet potato celebration as an aphrodisiac has also been picked up by Shakespeare, when Falstaff wishes for potatoes to rain from the sky when being faced with the prospect of two women joining him for some nighttime entertainment in the Merry Wives of Windsor. The famous English reputation in Tudor England for liking anything sweet must not entirely be dismissed either in the decision-making process on whether this recipe calls for our common potato or the sweet potato. My final stage in the recreation and research of this courage-inducing tart was to prepare two variations, one made from each tuber. The verdict was inconclusive, as both varieties tasted equally pleasant and neither delivered on their promise to provide courage. For recipe number 1, we can conclude without any doubts that the inclusion of expensive spices, hard to get hold of ingredients like the dates, and new exotic imported goods, the potatoes, combined with food preparation implements generally only used by the affluent in society, the chafing dish, points at this recipe as being served at lavish banquets only. For my second recipe, to make wafers from Thomas Dawson's The Good Housewife's Jewel, I operated more as an archaeologist than a historian, because the entire success of this dish depended on its execution with a specialist equipment known as the wafer or hot iron, as depicted in those slides. In the absence of any conclusive cooking instructions, and only equipped with a list of suggested ingredients, I got to work with my 16th century wafer irons, which I obtained, funny enough, from a local auction. On my mission to find the right consistency for the batter, I started with the ingredients as listed, but getting the right consistency was key. 16th century wafer irons are flat. And in the picture nearest to me, you can see that flat surface. And unlike later ones, they are very flat and therefore demand a much thicker batter for it not to run off the surface, by increasingly adding little more cream and rose water until the desired texture is reached and then baked in the preheated iron. I quickly learned that more cream makes it more likely to stick to the iron surface, ruining the beautiful imprint. Adding too much rose water led to an unpleasant, strong, soapy taste. This experimental process is, however, most rewarding, and it does help the food historian to fill in the gaps. In this case, my research relied heavily upon the use of the material object in order to reach a satisfactory conclusion on what the final product must have looked like and tasted. Without the wafer iron's functionality, getting the correct texture of the batter right would have been pure guesswork and based on nothing more but conjecture. In interpreting a recipe in its original setting, it is sometimes paramount to use contemporary, historically correct kitchenalia to test the recipe for its effectiveness. These objects may also reveal the socio-economic conditions prevailing when they were made, as in the case of our chafing dish. As Dr. Madeleine Shananan I hope I pronounced her name correct, observe in her publication of the 17th century manuscript recipe books as archaeological objects the use of documentary sources in archaeology is not universally accepted and within the field, and therefore dedicated archaeological examinations of recipes generally remain very rare. Concluding, we may observe that from the perspective of both historical archaeology and archaeological history, these recipes can tell us a lot more than just about taste preferences within a particular window of time. And along with others, I take the position that historic recipes and their elementary recreation provide the perfect example of a working relationship between historical archaeology and archaeological history. And in the line of my work, it's evident that textual objects such as recipe are situated in the very core of archaeological history, and together with the material evidence stemming from historical archaeology, they help to recover these morsels for us to consume, enjoy, and evaluate. Sadly, I can't hand out any samples today due to legislation, but if you wish to taste some Tudor food, both recipes appear in my book, and I believe there are 3 more copies available today out by the bookstand. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Brigitte and Josh too. We're all living in fear of encountering a burdock now, I think.